People reveal who they truly are when they believe someone beneath them has no voice. The words would have sounded like a fortune cookie cliché to anyone walking into Marlowe House that evening. But within the next few minutes, every crystal chandelier, polished marble floor, and designer tuxedo would silently prove them true. The annual Sullivan Technologies Foundation Gala was the kind of event people waited months to attend. Black SUVs lined the entrance. Photographers called out the names of politicians, investors, and celebrities, and a string quartet filled the grand dining room with gentle music that floated beneath the low hum of million-dollar conversations. Every champagne glass sparkled beneath warm golden light. Every table centerpiece had been flown in from California that morning, and every guest understood one unspoken rule. Richard Sullivan always owned the room. At 48, the white CEO had built one of America's fastest-growing technology companies through relentless discipline, impossible standards, and a reputation that made competitors nervous before negotiations even began. Employees admired his brilliance, feared his temper, and rarely questioned his judgment. Tonight, surrounded by board members, investors, and influential business leaders, Richard looked exactly as the magazines always described him. Impeccably tailored navy suit, silver watch catching the chandelier light, calm posture, controlled smile. Success seemed to fit him as naturally as the expensive leather shoes beneath his feet. Across the ballroom, almost invisible among dozens of servers dressed in identical black uniforms, Maya Brooks carried a silver tray balanced effortlessly against one hand. 26 years old, she moved quietly between tables with practiced precision, offering sparkling water, coffee, and desserts to guests who rarely looked at the faces behind the trays they accepted. Most people saw only another waitress. None of them knew she spent her mornings studying psychology through online classes before rushing across town to help her mother through dialysis appointments. None of them knew every extra shift meant another prescription filled, another utility bill paid, another week her family stayed afloat. Maya never expected anyone to notice. She only hoped to finish the evening without mistakes. She approached Richard's table just as laughter erupted among several executives discussing a recent acquisition. With a gentle smile, she lowered the tray slightly. "Would anyone care for fresh coffee?" she asked. Richard barely looked up at first. Then his eyes settled on Maya for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He studied her name tag, then her face, before glancing around the table as though an idea had suddenly entertained him. "Tell me something," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The conversations closest to the table softened. Several heads turned. Maya stopped politely. "Yes, sir." Richard leaned back in his chair with an amused smile that seemed designed more for his audience than for her. Do they teach public speaking before they hand out serving trays? Or do they just hope nobody notices the accent? A few restrained chuckles drifted around the table. Maya remained perfectly still. She had heard comments before. Different restaurants. Different customers. Same feeling. She answered with quiet professionalism. "I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, sir. Would you like coffee?" Richard's smile widened, encouraged by the attention now gathering from surrounding tables. Even his own daughter, 13-year-old Emily Sullivan, slowly lowered her fork and looked up from her plate, the warmth leaving her expression as silence quietly settled over the ballroom. Emily Sullivan did not laugh. While several executives exchanged amused glances and one investor hid a grin behind his wine glass, she remained perfectly still, her fingers resting against the polished silver fork beside her untouched dessert. She had attended enough charity dinners to recognize the difference between harmless humor and humiliation, and this did not feel like humor at all. Maya lowered her eyes only long enough to steady her breathing before lifting them again with quiet composure. "Fresh coffee, sir," she repeated gently, refusing to let embarrassment shape her voice. The room lingered in an uncomfortable silence until Richard waved one dismissive hand. "No, thank you," he said with a smile that carried more performance than kindness. "I was simply curious." Maya nodded politely and continued toward the next table as though nothing had happened, balancing the silver tray with practiced grace despite the weight pressing against her chest. She had learned years ago that dignity was sometimes measured not by what people said to you, but by what you refused to become after hearing it. As she disappeared into the flow of servers weaving between white linen tables, The music slowly returned to the foreground. Conversations cautiously resumed, and glasses clinked once again beneath the golden chandeliers. Yet something invisible had shifted. Emily's eyes quietly followed Maya across the ballroom. She noticed the waitress stopping to refill an elderly woman's water before the guest even realized her glass was empty. She watched Maya kneel briefly beside a young boy attending with his parents, helping him retrieve the napkin he had accidentally dropped without making him feel embarrassed. Every movement seemed thoughtful, calm, almost effortless. There was no resentment in her expression, no visible anger, only steady professionalism that somehow made the earlier remark feel even smaller. Emily remembered another evening nearly 6 months earlier, although her father never knew about it. She had slipped away from a corporate dinner after feeling overwhelmed by dozens of unfamiliar adults speaking over one another. Hidden near the service hallway, she had struggled to catch her breath while fighting back anxious tears she could not explain. Most people walked past without noticing. One person had stopped. A young waitress carrying folded tablecloths had quietly sat several feet away instead of crowding her. She had offered a bottle of water, waited patiently through the silence, and spoken only after Emily looked up first. Sometimes loud rooms feel even louder when your mind is already full, the waitress had said softly. You do not have to rush yourself. She never asked Emily's last name. She never treated her differently after recognizing the Sullivan family crest, embroidered on the invitation lying beside her chair. Before returning to work, she simply smiled and said, "Everyone deserves a little patience on difficult days." Emily had never forgotten those words. Across the ballroom now, watching that same woman continue serving guests who barely acknowledged her presence, Emily felt a knot tighten inside her chest. She glanced toward her father. Richard had already returned to discussing quarterly projections and investment strategies as though the exchange had never happened. Around him, influential voices filled the room again, confident and polished beneath the soft glow of crystal light. Yet Emily could no longer hear any of it clearly. Her attention stayed fixed on Maya Brooks, who continued moving from table to table with quiet strength, unaware that before the evening was over, the person least expected to challenge the most powerful man in the ballroom would be sitting only a few feet away from him. The evening flowed forward with the polished rhythm expected of an event where every minute had been planned months in advance. Waiters carried elegant plates across the ballroom in perfect coordination, while soft piano music blended into quiet conversations about markets, philanthropy, and the future of artificial intelligence. On the elevated stage, a massive screen displayed photographs of scholarship recipients whose education had been funded by the Sullivan Technologies Foundation. Guests applauded warmly as each image faded into the next, yet behind the carefully crafted atmosphere, Richard Sullivan's attention remained fixed on control. He believed every successful evening depended on flawless execution, and flawless execution depended on people knowing exactly where they belonged. He glanced toward the service area and noticed Maya speaking briefly with an elderly couple seated near the back of the room. The older gentleman smiled gratefully as she carefully adjusted the position of his walker before returning his dinner plate. His wife reached for Maya's hand for only a second, offering a thankful nod that seemed genuine enough to brighten the waitress's face despite everything that had happened earlier. Richard observed the exchange without expression. "She certainly likes making herself memorable," he muttered before taking another sip of sparkling water. One executive beside him chuckled politely, eager to agree with whatever the chief executive officer said. Emily heard every word. She slowly folded her linen napkin across her lap and looked around the ballroom instead of responding. Since her mother's passing 3 years earlier, she had watched her father become increasingly distant from the people around him. He still donated millions to charities. He still funded hospitals, scholarships, and community programs. Newspapers called him generous. Television interviews praised his leadership. Yet somewhere between board meetings and business victories, kindness had become something he preferred to purchase rather than practice. Emily remembered how different he once was. Before success consumed every corner of his schedule, he used to kneel beside her bicycle and patiently tighten loose training wheels. He used to thank cashiers by name. He used to tell her that character mattered more than talent because talent could impress people while character changed them. She wondered where that version of her father had disappeared. Across the ballroom, Maya entered the service station to exchange empty coffee pots for fresh ones. Steam drifted gently upward as another server quietly whispered, "Are you all right?" Maya answered with a small smile that carried more reassurance than sadness. "I will be," she said softly. "There are still guests who deserve a good evening." She adjusted the sleeves of her uniform, lifted the polished coffee pot, and returned through the double doors with the same calm posture she had carried since the event began. Not once did she glance toward Richard's table. She simply continued serving each guest with equal respect, whether they acknowledged her or not. Emily watched that quiet determination with growing admiration. She realized that real strength rarely arrived with raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it looked like choosing grace when no one would blame you for anger. Meanwhile, Richard checked his watch as one of his assistants leaned close and whispered that the final investment announcement would begin in less than 15 minutes. Important partners from across the country had traveled to attend, and several major news outlets were waiting to report on the evening's success. Everything needed to appear perfect. As Maya approached once more carrying a fresh pot of coffee, Richard casually reached inside his tailored jacket to retrieve his leather wallet before placing it beside his dinner plate. No one noticed the subtle movement except Emily, whose eyes lingered on the wallet for reasons she could not yet explain. A quiet feeling settled over her, the kind that arrives moments before a storm, when the air seems perfectly still even though everything is about to change. The ballroom settled into a polished rhythm once again as servers moved between tables with fresh coffee and dessert plates, their quiet footsteps almost disappearing beneath the gentle notes of the piano. Maya approached Richard Sullivan's table with steady hands, carefully pouring coffee into the cup of one board member before offering the pot to the others. Richard declined with a slight wave, but as Maya turned toward the next guest, he casually reached for his leather wallet, glanced inside for a brief second, then slipped it beneath the edge of his folded dinner napkin where it was barely visible from anyone else's seat. Emily noticed the movement without understanding why her father seemed unusually deliberate. Richard leaned back in his chair, allowing nearly a full minute to pass while Maya continued serving the neighboring tables. Then, just as she stepped away toward the center of the ballroom, he suddenly patted the inside pocket of his jacket. His expression changed instantly. He checked the opposite pocket, then the inside of his suit coat again. Finally, he looked beneath the table with exaggerated surprise before speaking loudly enough for several nearby conversations to stop. "That is strange." More heads turned. Richard slowly stood, adjusting his jacket as though genuinely puzzled. "Has anyone seen my wallet?" One executive immediately searched beneath his chair while another looked. Across the table, a hostess hurried over. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sullivan?" Richard answered calmly, almost too calmly. "My wallet was here only a moment ago." His eyes drifted toward Maya, who had paused several feet away after hearing her employer mention the missing item. "Miss," Richard called. Maya walked back with composed professionalism. "Yes, sir." Richard folded his arms. "You were the last person standing beside this table." The words floated through the ballroom like cold air. Maya blinked once, surprised more by the implication than the question itself. "I serve coffee, sir." "Exactly," Richard replied. "And now my wallet is gone." The nearby conversations faded into complete silence. Crystal glasses rested untouched. Even the musicians quietly lowered their volume as curious guests began watching from neighboring tables. Maya kept her voice calm. "I have not seen your wallet." Richard nodded slowly, wearing the expression of a man determined to appear reasonable. "Then you would not mind if we cleared this up." The restaurant manager hurried across the marble floor, concern visible on his face. "Mr. Sullivan, perhaps it simply slipped beneath the table." Several employees searched around the chairs, under the white linen tablecloth, and beside the stage. Nothing appeared. Richard sighed softly. "I would hate for anyone to misunderstand the situation," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But valuable items do not simply disappear." Maya felt dozens of unfamiliar eyes settle upon her. She could almost hear her own heartbeat beneath the silence. Still, she refused to let fear change her posture. "You are welcome to check wherever necessary," she answered quietly. "I have nothing that belongs to you." Richard looked toward the manager. "Would you ask her to wait until security reviews the cameras?" The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded. "Miss Brooks, would you please come with me to the hospitality office for just a few minutes?" Maya offered no argument. She simply placed the silver coffee pot back onto her serving tray and handed it carefully to another waitress before folding her hands in front of her. Across the table, Emily stared at her father in disbelief. She had seen exactly where he placed the wallet only moments earlier. It had never disappeared. It had only disappeared from the story he wanted everyone else to believe. The hospitality office sat just beyond a pair of polished oak doors, separated from the ballroom by only a short hallway, yet it felt like an entirely different world. The distant sound of piano music faded behind the walls, replaced by the quiet hum of air conditioning and the ticking of a brass clock mounted above a row of framed awards. Maya stood calmly beside a small conference table, her hands folded loosely in front of her apron. The restaurant manager looked genuinely uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact as two security employees prepared to review the surveillance recordings. "Miss Brooks," the manager said carefully, "this is only a routine procedure. We simply need to confirm what happened." Maya nodded with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the evening. "I understand." She did not ask why she had been singled out. She did not demand an apology. She simply waited. Back inside the ballroom, however, one person could no longer remain silent. Emily slowly pushed her chair away from the table, the soft scrape of wood against marble drawing her father's attention. Richard looked up. "Where are you going?" he asked. Emily met his eyes without hesitation. "To tell the truth." Richard's expression hardened immediately. "Sit down." She remained standing. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances as nearby conversations disappeared once again. "Dad?" Emily said quietly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear. "She did not take your wallet." Richard answered in the controlled tone he often used during difficult board meetings. "Emily, you are too young to understand everything that is happening." "I understand exactly what I saw," she replied. The silence surrounding the table deepened. Richard leaned slightly forward. "Enough." Emily shook her head. "No. You placed your wallet under your napkin before she walked away." One investor slowly lowered his glass. Another board member looked toward Richard with visible uncertainty. Richard kept his face remarkably composed, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are mistaken." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, yet her voice remained steady. "I am not mistaken." She remembered every detail. The way his hand had slipped beneath the folded linen. The brief glance around the table. The deliberate pause before announcing the wallet was missing. None of it had been accidental. Around them, guests who had once admired the confident chief executive officer now watched with growing curiosity. No one interrupted. No one defended either side. They simply listened. Richard rose slowly from his chair. "Emily," he said, lowering his voice, "this conversation is over." But Emily did not move. "You always taught me that honesty matters," she said. "You told me character is what people do when nobody can force them to do the right thing. I believed you." Those words struck the table with far more force than any raised voice could have carried. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the restaurant manager hurried back into the ballroom. His face showed both relief and confusion. "Mr. Sullivan," he said respectfully, "security is reviewing the footage now. They asked if everyone involved could come to the monitoring room together." Richard gave a short nod. "Very well." Emily quietly followed several steps behind as the small group crossed the marble floor toward the hallway. Behind them, dozens of guests watched in complete silence, sensing that whatever appeared on those security monitors would decide far more than the location of a missing wallet. It would reveal which version of the evening everyone would remember for years to come. The security monitoring room was small, windowless, and unusually quiet compared to the elegance of the ballroom only a few yards away. Four large monitors covered one wall, their pale glow reflecting across polished tile floors and stainless steel cabinets. The air felt cooler there, carrying the faint scent of fresh coffee and humming electronics. Maya remained standing beside the conference table without crossing her arms or lowering her head. She simply waited, breathing slowly, as though patience had become something she practiced every day instead of something she possessed naturally. Richard stood several feet away with the composed posture that had carried him through countless negotiations, while Emily quietly took the empty chair beside Maya, instead of standing beside her father. That single choice did not go unnoticed. The restaurant manager glanced toward Emily before looking back at the security technician, who carefully loaded the recording from camera 7 overlooking the center of the ballroom. "We are about 3 minutes before the reported incident," he explained softly. Nobody answered. The room became so still that the gentle clicking of the computer mouse sounded unusually loud. Before the recording began, Emily looked toward Maya. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I am sorry you are going through this." Maya turned slightly, surprised more by the sincerity than the words themselves. A gentle smile appeared despite everything that had happened. "Thank you," she replied quietly. "Sometimes people only see what they expect to see." Emily lowered her eyes. "I should have spoken sooner." Maya shook her head almost imperceptibly. "You spoke when it mattered." Those 6 words settled into the room with unexpected warmth. The manager slowly removed his glasses, pretending to clean the lenses while hiding the emotion beginning to show across his face. Even one of the security employees quietly looked away for a second before returning his attention to the monitor. Richard remained silent, staring at the paused image frozen on the screen. His expression did not change, but for the first time that evening, certainty no longer seemed as effortless as it had inside the ballroom. Emily reached into the pocket of her evening dress and removed a neatly folded white handkerchief embroidered with small blue flowers along one corner. She offered it toward Maya without saying another word. Maya accepted it carefully, not because she was crying, but because she understood the meaning behind the gesture. It was kindness offered without expectation. She unfolded the handkerchief, just enough to smooth one corner between her fingers before quietly folding it again. The simple piece of cloth reminded her of the towels she washed each weekend while helping care for her mother at home. Familiar, ordinary, comforting. Outside the closed door, the distant sound of applause drifted faintly from the ballroom as another speaker apparently took the stage, completely unaware that a far more important moment was unfolding behind the scenes. Inside the monitoring room, no one seemed interested in the gala anymore. Expensive suits, impressive titles, and carefully rehearsed speeches suddenly felt insignificant compared to the quiet courage sitting beside a young waitress who had every reason to become bitter but had chosen grace instead. The technician rested one hand above the keyboard. "The recording is ready," he said softly. His finger hovered over the play button without pressing it immediately. Every pair of eyes settled on the screen. The frozen image showed Richard seated at the banquet table, Maya approaching with a silver coffee pot, and Emily watching from across the white linen tablecloth. In that silent frame, the truth had already happened. It simply had not reached everyone else yet. The technician pressed the play button, and the silent recording began to move. Every second unfolded with unforgiving precision beneath the cool glow of the security monitors. Richard appeared exactly where everyone remembered him, seated confidently at the center of the table while executives laughed around him. Maya entered the frame carrying a polished silver coffee pot, stopping beside each guest with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. No one in the room spoke. The only sound came from the faint whir of the computer. Emily leaned forward almost unconsciously. Maya watched the screen without trying to defend herself. Richard stood motionless with his hands folded behind his back. Then the recording reached the moment that mattered. The camera clearly captured Richard removing his leather wallet from inside his jacket. Instead of returning it to his pocket, he glanced briefly around the table before sliding it beneath. The folded dinner napkin exactly as Emily had described. Maya was already pouring coffee for another guest several feet away. She never looked toward the wallet. She never reached for the table. She simply continued serving drinks before walking toward another section of the ballroom. The technician paused the recording. The room became completely silent. Nobody needed an explanation. The truth had spoken for itself. The manager slowly exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for several minutes. One security employee quietly shook his head. Emily looked toward her father, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might resemble the man she remembered from years ago. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the frozen image of his own hand resting beside the hidden wallet. For the first time in years, there was no negotiation to win, no presentation to control, no carefully chosen words capable of changing what everyone had just witnessed. The evidence was simple. So was the shame. As the technician prepared to close the recording, another detail caught his attention. "Wait," he said softly. He rewound the footage by less than a minute and enlarged another camera angle overlooking the side of the ballroom. The clearer view showed something no one had noticed before. While returning from another table, Maya suddenly stopped beside Richard's chair. She bent down briefly, reaching beneath the edge of the table. A small object glimmered beneath the chandelier light. It was a plain gold wedding band that had rolled onto the marble floor without anyone noticing. Maya picked it up carefully, looked around for Richard, saw him speaking with investors across the room, and quietly slipped the ring into the small front pocket of her apron instead of leaving it where someone else might accidentally step on it. Seconds later, she returned to work, never mentioning it because she intended to hand it back once the conversations around him had settled. The technician froze the image once more. The manager stared at the monitor in disbelief. Emily covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Richard slowly closed his eyes. That ring had belonged to his late wife. He had worn it on a thin chain inside his jacket for 3 years without missing a single gala. Earlier that evening, the chain must have broken without him realizing it. While he had been publicly questioning Maya's honesty, she had quietly protected the one possession he treasured most. Maya reached into the pocket of her apron without a word and placed the gold ring gently on the conference table between them. "I was waiting for the right moment to return it," she said softly. It looked important. Richard stared at the ring reflecting beneath the fluorescent light, and for the first time that night, he could not bear to look away from the woman he had judged so quickly. Richard looked at the gold wedding band resting on the conference table as though he were seeing a piece of his own life for the first time. The polished surface reflected the bright fluorescent lights above, but what weighed on him was not the ring itself. It was the realization that while he had questioned Maya's integrity in front of an entire ballroom, she had quietly protected one of the few possessions that still connected him to the woman he had loved most. The room remained silent. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt the moment. Finally, Richard reached forward with an unsteady hand and carefully picked up the ring. He turned it slowly between his fingers until the small engraving inside became visible. "Forever, Eleanor." His late wife's handwriting had inspired those 2 simple words. He closed his hand around the ring and released a slow breath. When he looked back at Maya, the confidence that had defined him all evening had disappeared. In its place stood a man forced to confront the difference between reputation and character. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you far more than an explanation." Maya met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried since the evening began. She did not appear triumphant. She did not seem angry. She simply listened. Richard lowered his head, something very few people had ever seen him do. "I judged you before I knew you. I embarrassed you before people who trusted my opinion. I allowed my position to become more important than the truth." His words were measured, but sincere. The restaurant manager looked down respectfully, while the security employees exchanged silent glances. Emily watched her father carefully, recognizing a humility she had not seen in years. Richard continued, "There is no excuse for what I did." He turned toward the manager. "Please bring everyone back into the ballroom." A few minutes later, the guests who had spent the last half hour whispering among themselves watched as Richard returned to the stage instead of the scheduled keynote speaker. The conversations gradually faded until only the soft hum of the chandeliers filled the grand room. Maya stood near the side entrance beside the other servers, hoping to disappear quietly into the background once more. Instead, Richard looked directly toward her. "Before this evening continues," he said into the microphone, "there is something I need to correct." I followed his gaze. "Earlier tonight, I publicly questioned the honesty of a member of this staff. I was wrong." The words echoed through the ballroom. The security footage proved that she acted with complete integrity. Even more than that, she protected something deeply personal to me without expecting recognition or reward. The mistake was entirely mine. No one moved. Richard stepped down from the stage and walked across the marble floor until he stood only a few feet from Maya. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice no longer amplified by the microphone, yet somehow reaching every corner of the room. "I am truly sorry." Maya looked at him for a long moment before offering a gentle smile. "Thank you for saying that." Richard seemed surprised by how quickly forgiveness arrived. "After everything I put you through, you can still smile?" Maya answered softly. Holding on to kindness does not mean forgetting what happened. It simply means refusing to let someone else's mistake decide the person I become. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes as she quietly stepped beside Maya. Richard looked from his daughter to the young waitress and understood something no business seminar, leadership book, or board meeting had ever taught him. Respect could never be demanded through power. It had to be earned through humility, honesty, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. 3 months later, the first light of an early autumn morning poured through the tall windows of Marlowe House, painting warm ribbons of gold across the same marble floor where silence had once carried humiliation instead of hope. The restaurant looked different, not because the furniture had changed or the chandeliers shined any brighter, but because the people inside carried themselves differently. Staff members greeted one another by name. Managers thanked servers before every shift. New employees were reminded that every person who walked through the doors, whether wearing an expensive suit or a service uniform, deserved the same respect. Some transformations happened quietly, one conversation at a time. Richard Sullivan became one of those quiet changes. He still led board meetings, negotiated major contracts, and appeared on business magazine covers. But those who worked beside him noticed something they had never expected. He listened before speaking. He thanked people without looking at his phone. He remembered names. Every few weeks, he returned to Marlowe House, never requesting a private dining room, never asking for special treatment. Whenever Maya happened to be working, he greeted her with the same simple words. "Good evening, Miss Brooks. It is nice to see you again." There was no awkwardness left in the greeting, only respect. Maya's life continued with the steady rhythm she had always valued. She attended her online classes during the day, accompanied her mother to dialysis appointments twice each week, and worked evening shifts with the same quiet dedication that had always defined her. She never told new coworkers about what had happened during the foundation gala. She never described the apology, the security footage, or the crowded ballroom. To her, those moments belonged in the past. What mattered more was the choice she made afterward. She refused to let one painful evening become the story that defined her future. Emily visited the restaurant several times as well. Sometimes she brought homework. Sometimes she simply ordered hot chocolate and sat near the window while reading. Before leaving, she always spent a few minutes talking with Maya, whose calm wisdom had become an unexpected source of encouragement. One afternoon, Emily smiled and said, "You know, I used to think courage meant standing in front of people." Maya looked out the window where golden leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk before answering. Sometimes courage is simply choosing to remain kind after someone gives you every reason not to. Emily carried those words with her long after the conversation ended. On the anniversary of the gala, Richard quietly established a scholarship in his late wife's memory for students pursuing careers in psychology and community care. He insisted that applications would be judged only by character, perseverance, and service to others. During the private dedication, he asked Maya to attend as a guest rather than an employee. She accepted with the same humble smile she had always worn. As the ceremony ended, Richard slipped the gold wedding band back onto the chain around his neck. This time he checked the clasp twice before fastening it securely. He glanced toward Maya, then toward Emily, and offered a grateful nod that required no speech. Outside, a gentle breeze carried the first leaves of the season across the front steps. Sunlight reflected softly through the glass entrance as guests quietly made their way home. Maya walked toward the bus stop with her backpack resting lightly over one shoulder, the evening sky glowing in shades of amber and blue above the city. Behind her, the restaurant doors closed gently. Ahead of her, another ordinary day waited. She smiled to herself, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because she knew something far more valuable than power had the strength to outlast it. Kindness had not made her weaker. It had quietly changed every heart willing to see it.